Welcome back to the second part of this series where we are talking about US, China, and Taiwan crisis unfolding in the recent times. In the last video, we had a look around the historical context of why this crisis is unfolding in the first place. In this video, we are going to talk about the current context and the economic repercussions that this crisis is going to have not only for these three countries, but also for India in the context of what has already happened in Russia and Ukraine. So I think the first question that I'm going to touch upon from the last video, which we concluded, was Tsai Ing-wen, which turned out to be the president of Taiwan and is a pro-democratic leader, after which China has started reacting a lot. So why don't you take us through that, Surya, and maybe then we will delve into other topics.
Yeah, there are two leaders who were elected at somewhat the same time. So Xi Jinping came to power in 2012 after Hu Jintao's presidency, and Tsai Ing-wen, she came into power in 2016, and she is a person who sees herself as an pro-independence movement, right? She sees herself as a leader of the pro-independence movement, and Xi Jinping sees the integration of Taiwan as a matter of life or death almost. Because if you realize, the aim of the Chinese Communist Party is to unite the Chinese mainland with Taiwan and end the century of humiliation by the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic in 1949. So by 2049, they want all of these issues to be solved, both with Hong Kong. Hong Kong, as you know, it's pretty much been solved, Macau as well, and now this. So, and she is seen as a bit of he takes inspiration from Mao, even though his father was purged by Mao in the Cultural Revolution. And if you realize that, if you remember, sorry, that in 2018, there was a party congress which removed term limits, as I alluded to in the previous video, right? Basically, every president after Mao could only have 2 terms, after which he had to be replaced. But those guardrails were removed in 2018. And now, later this year, I think around November, if I'm not wrong, there's another party conference where Xi Jinping will be voted in for either a third term or he could even be president for life. So there is a big political event coming up in the People's Republic right now, because of which they can't seem to be weak. Even though they don't really want a war, they have to respond. Otherwise, Xi's position as General Secretary of the Communist Party and the president will be, very sticky, because in an authoritarian regime, there will be generals, there will be other factions in the Communist Party who would want to take over your, probably orchestrate a coup and take it over, right? So the thing is, whether he likes it or not, he has to respond. And this is when, at a time when the Chinese aren't doing so well either. China's economy is slowing, as you know, and a lot of these banks and these construction companies that have gone bust recently, Evergrande being the biggest one. I'm sure you've seen it. So this points to a very precarious position for Xi Jinping right now, because the Chinese economy, for better or worse, is built on the growth of the real estate market, as you know.
Absolutely.
So real estate market, right? So if the real estate market collapses, as it probably is right now, because a lot of these companies have taken very unsustainable debts and are unable to pay back. And now what is happening, I'm sure you saw last week, there were protests because some banks said your deposits will be used as investment, and don't worry, we will give you your money back. So people are not paying their mortgages right now, and a collapse of the real estate market in China and the real estate economy will result in the crash of the entire economy, because the growth after 2008 was through infrastructure and through real estate. So she has a lot of domestic political battles that he has to fight, and him being needled by the US like this, and this is not just needling, this is a full-blown provocation in the eyes of the Chinese Communist Party. So he has to respond in a way which makes him look tough, but at the same time does not risk a war, because right now China does not have the capacity to occupy Taiwan. Just a parallel, right? We have seen the Russians struggling in Ukraine, even though they share a land border, right? And the land that connects the two is flat; it's a plain land. Despite this, the Russians have struggled. Invading across the sea, 100 miles of ocean, is a very, very different ball game. So And it's not like where, how Russia, they just want to subjugate certain parts of Ukraine and prevent them from joining NATO. The Chinese want to take over the island. So which means they not only have to move men, they also have to move in tanks and other kinds of weapons to actually to the island, and leading them to, possibly be sunk in the Taiwan Strait. Now, obviously, in a war, there are going to be casualties. But the thing is, one thing about China is that they have the one-child policy for a very, very long time. So a lot of the soldiers in the People's Liberation Army today are conscripts. Forcefully, they have to enroll in the military, and they are also largely, just a single child of their parents. And the PLA has never really seen any combat per se. The only thing that they've seen in recent times was in 1979 when they invaded Vietnam to get them out of Cambodia, and that was a miserable failure. The Americans lost to them about 5 years before that, and then now the Chinese as well. So after that, they haven't really seen combat. So to have a Normandy type amphibious assault on an island with no capacity is very difficult, and they're going to lose a lot of soldiers even before they actually reach the island. And troop morale, as we know, is very, very important in a war. And a conscript soldier who's not even seen combat is suddenly seeing all of his comrades just die and just, in the water, right? Which is something that the Chinese have been worried about. Not to mention, as I said in the previous video, the Americans have tacitly said that we will back the Taiwanese if there is an invasion of Taiwan by the PRC. And as we have seen how they have backed the Ukrainians by giving them weapons, right? The engagement here could be greater because Taiwan is of much more importance to the US than Ukraine is.
So, I mean, I love the way that you have portrayed this analogy between Russia, Ukraine, how even though Ukraine is much smaller, but the morale is a big, factor when it comes to fighting any war, even however big a country might be. And in fact, the way that you portrayed about the Evergrande crisis, because what we have always thought of is China as a too big to fail case, right? But the way that things are unfolding at this juncture, it might not be very surprising to see US housing crisis parlance at Chinese housing crisis. And that is what I believe could be a major watershed moment, especially at the time when China is the consumption driver of the entire globe in a major sense. So, of course, economic repercussions come from that domestic point of view that you raised. But I think there are three major points that I want to discuss, especially in the economic sense of what is happening as of now. The first, I want to start off with the most obvious and the most impactful thing that every country around the world is going to face, which is supply chain concerns coming out of chips. Now, Taiwan has been a source of it. And so why don't you take this up, Surya, and, shed some light over this?
So yeah, as you know, every device that we use, the device we're recording on currently, is runs on a microprocessor, right? A semiconductor based chip. Now, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, the TSMC, manufactures the most. It has almost a global monopoly when it comes to chip manufacturing. Only now you're seeing Apple running its own chips on its laptops and phones, but for a very, very long time, the TSMC was the pioneer in chip technology. So that technology should not fall into the hands of the Chinese, the People's Republic, in the eyes of the US, because that is proprietary technology that has been developed by companies like Qualcomm and Intel, right? And they don't want the technology to fall into the hands of an enemy nation, because let's face it, in say 10 years, when China actually decides to invade Taiwan, or whenever it's going to happen, it is going to happen, I believe. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. The US will directly be an adversary in some form or the other. So having the Chinese control the supply of chips, which is not only used for for cars, for all of that, it's also used to manufacture some of the high-tech weapons that the US military has. And that cannot fall into the hands of the Chinese under any circumstance. So this is, an invasion or even a situation in the Taiwan Strait would result in a significant drop in the supply of chips to the world. As we have seen, even cars today are being delayed because there is a delay in the supply of chips. And this, of course, is because of the whole COVID crisis and the supply chain crisis that came along with it, because China's ports are closed. But if there is a war, then it's a whole different thing, because China could just, say, okay, we're not going to let any chips go to the US anymore. So that is going to be very disastrous. And any US ally that supports the US in any way could also bear the brunt of this.
Absolutely. So I think, what has become even more important in this juncture is inflation. Because if you see, it's majorly deriving its roots from supply chain crises, starting from the very fact that crude oil has been ballooning since the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Now, if something like this happens, especially at a point when technology has become of enormous importance, if chips are missing, technology is going to fall back, and the growth rates, the productivity that a nation has is going to get affected immensely. So on a macro sense also, inflation is going to become a much bigger concern if something like this happens, not just from chips perspective, but from a larger trade perspective as well. As you shared, right, if a US ally, especially for a nation like ours, even though however bad we might say about China, at the end of the day, we are one of the largest trading partners with China, and that somehow affects our economy to a great extent. So something like this happening, God forbid, is going to have multiple repercussions at not only at China, Taiwan, or US level, but also for us at a larger sense. So thank you very much for that perspective. Let me come to the second point, Surya. I think so if we see where we are standing today, it won't be wrong to call that it's the point where from when the renewable energy, or let's say everything which is green mobility, is what we are aspiring to enter into the new territories. Something like 2000 for Google is what I believe is as of now for the smart mobility times, right? And there, if you see, the biggest factor is batteries. And even in batteries, there are rare earth materials, because without it, the entire concept, falls back for the smart mobility. And in before in not speaking much about it, why don't you take us through the importance of rare earth materials in this larger context?
So China is the biggest producer of rare earths in the world. Not only because they have large reserves, they're also buying up mines in Africa which have these metals. So things like cobalt, nickel, lithium, right, among other rare earth metals. And in case of a war, the Chinese could block the supply of these rare earths to US or whoever they're fighting. So it's going to be US and its allies at the time. So, and that could very well mean India, definitely, because with the quadrilateral dialogue that's been initiated, right? The More or less, India will side with the US. It's not going to be as neutral as it was, as it is rather, during this whole Russia-Ukraine crisis. But I think we will actively, or to an extent, be on the side of the US, be seen as on the side of the US. Which means our rare earth supplies could also be hit. And if rare earths are hit, as you said, we can't make batteries for electric cars, sorry, and for to run these pumps, the charging stations, among other things, we can't store that energy. So it's and with the government's aim of reducing our emission to bring a net zero by 2070, could suffer a serious impact if rare earths are cut off. So, which is why we are exploring rare earths among our allies in Africa as well. We are trying to secure our own supplies. But as of now, the Chinese are the largest suppliers of rare earths in the world. So, any conflict with them is going to have repercussions with the supply of these rare earth materials. And that is something that we have to plan for, and we have to be extremely careful, because that is something on which our economy is based, or going to be based to a large extent.
Absolutely. So I think, just to conclude this video, I want to take your stance on what it means for India, especially when Russia-Ukraine happened, and what is happening as of now. So if you see, we have seen a lot of dependence on a lot of materials towards China. But what we are gradually trying to do is become Atmanirbhar in real sense. Foundries which are used for making chips, or something which we are exploring to a very fast extent in India also. Rare earth, as you said, we are trying to explore more reserves within the country and also with our partners. So, what do you think should India's strategy be at this point? If moving away from China, what should be our focus point? Is it European side? Is it Middle East? What side should we look forward to have a robust partnership which falls, which fills for the gap that might be coming in the future times?
In my opinion, I think it makes sense for us politically and economically speaking to be seen as an ally of the US, not a combat committed ally at least, but definitely an ally, because the economic relations that we have with the US are far more important than the relations we have with China because of all the tech and the number of people who go to study there and the large Indian American population, among other things, right? So the thing is, we should not actively start a shooting war with China, which we won't, of course, but I'm just saying, if there a war breaks out in South China Sea. But here's what's going, in my opinion, probably going to happen is that the Chinese will use this, the pretext of war to say, okay, you know what, India fired at us and we're going to fire back at them, right? And actually start a conflict along the line of actual control. In which case we should be ready. I think Galwan, what happened in Galwan 2 years ago is a watershed moment for the Indian security apparatus. And we do not take the Chinese lightly anymore. We know that, they're going to attack someday or the other, and we are going to defend ourselves. But what's going to happen is, if it becomes a shooting war between India and China, what we will do is go from a tacit ally of the US to a complete, combat committed one, which means the jugular of China is the Malacca Strait between Singapore and Malaysia.
Yes.
We are going to try and block that, which would cut off China's gas supply and gas and natural gas and oil supply to a large extent. About 70% of it comes through the Strait of Malacca, and it is also going to stop the exports through the Malacca Strait. The Chinese exports that come through the Chinese ports. This would cripple the Chinese economy completely. It would ruin Chinese economy to an extent where they probably can't recover if the blockade is successful and China starved these materials. Of course, they are taking steps to reduce the dependence on the Malacca, but that will take decades. And in the meantime, if there is a war that breaks out, definitely we will move to block it. And that's where the Andaman and Nicobar Islands come into such importance, because not only is it an island where some islands, as we can't go there because of the tribes, but it is also the home of India's first and major tri-services base, where the Army, the Air Force, and Navy have a base there, where we have our surveillance in the East Indian Ocean, and we have so you can monitor Chinese naval vessel movement in the Indian Ocean as well. So in the case of a war, we're going to, I believe that India will ultimately be dragged into the conflict and on the side of the US. So in which case we should prepare ourselves. But in the long run, economically, things like the production linked incentive scheme that the government has come out with, it is showing some success where we are not only assembling product, but we're also manufacturing a large number of goods that were earlier manufactured in China. So I think this needs to grow. This needs to grow significantly. It needs to permeate into many sectors, not just technology, but a lot. Like, for example, pharma, where we are known as a world's pharmacy, but the ingredients that go into the making of these medicines are all made in China, largely for the whole world. So we do not want them to be controlling our supply of medicines or technology, right? So the manufacture of active pharmaceutical ingredients, as they're called, is something that India is also looking at to domesticate and not domesticate, rather to bring it back to Indian shores and reduce our dependence. So in the long run, our aim would be to reduce dependence on the Chinese and not exactly be a card-carrying ally of the US, because they're into a lot of conflicts, right? And this comes to my next major point. How many fronts can both these countries fight on? Because if you look at the US, they're already embroiled in a proxy war of sorts with Russia and Ukraine in Europe. Now they are, they're also in the Korean Peninsula controlling Kim Jong-un. They are also in Japan and in the South China Sea. And now a shooting war in the South China Sea and a shooting war in Russia, if it were ever to come to that, would require a large deployment of US Navy and US Marines. And do they have the capacity to fight two major superpowers like that Probably not. They have to rely on allies. And as you know, if you come to China, they have an issue with Japan on the Senkaku Islands, and that's something they've been trying to get back from the Japanese for a long time. Um, they have, of course, the Taiwan issue, which nobody needs to, nobody can forget. They want to control the entire South China Sea, which is something that the US is not going to allow them to. And they also have border skirmishes with India along the line of actual control. So many fronts being opened up by both countries is untenable in my opinion. And how that's going to take place is something that we don't know. I think we all thought that we're not going to see a shooting war anymore, but I think the Russia-Ukraine thing took away any of our any beliefs that we had that a peaceful solution can be brought about. So definitely there will be some kind of conflict in the future, and I think excuse me, our best way to go about it is prepare our military through our domestic military industrial complex, and a lot of the economic growth that we have should be centered at home and not be reliant on foreign imports and things like that. So where we can minimize a blowback if there is a conflict between two major or three major superpowers in the world.
Got it. So I think that's it, Surya. I think we have been able to properly, and especially thank you to you. Basically have been able to wrap up the entire topic, so complex topic, in this two small parts, and where we have not only spoken about the current context, historical context, and most importantly about the economic repercussions. So with this, I'd like to thank you once again, and we look forward to hosting you once again in some other time for some IR issue which comes up.
Thank you, Sandesh.
Thank you very much. Have a good day, Surya. Bye bye.